Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. Now, have you ever read a book by an author from the Central African Republic? No, I thought not. Well, perhaps you have, but certainly I hadn't until a month ago when I read Co-Wives, Co-Widows by Adrienne Yabouza. So this is a scallydandle video, one where I'm talking about a book that I read in the course of my personal quest to read a book by an author from every country in the world. And I'm now down to those countries. They're a little bit more challenging to find something in English and readily available. So you can imagine how thrilled I was to hear about this book. It was first published in 2015, and then it was translated and came out in English in late 2021. The translator is Rachael McGill. She's done a fine job. The publisher is Daedalus. It's part of their African Writers series, which is superb. There's not loads. I think I've read 4 out of the 7 or 8 they've published so far. It is, as far as I know, the first novel from the Central African Republic that's been translated into English. So for an Anglophone reader, it's a wonderful opportunity. And fortunately, this book is well worth anyone's time to read. It's funny, it's vivid in its description, it's moving, at times tragic. It's got 2 really strong central characters that you get to know and root for, Ndongo Pasi and Greg Pubu, and they're the co-wives of the title. And then a host of minor characters around them that are like a lovely cast. Some of them very real, some of them more kind of like entertaining, including their slightly foolish old husband, Lidiu. Now, I would say that this book is written for a readership in the Central African Republic. But that makes it the perfect scallydandle book for me because it's got, there's no concessions to a reader from elsewhere, but you get thrown into the atmosphere, the politics, the social relationships and culture of the Central African Republic, but in a really good translation. So I always start these videos with a little bit of geography and history, don't I? Let's find the Central African Republic on my trusty globe. Now then, there it is. You see there? So it really is, rather a literal country name that is very much in the middle of the African subcontinent. If you imagine, it's got Chad to the north of it, Sudan and South Sudan to the east. Beneath it is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I trip over that because that country is anything but democratic. And the Republic of Congo next to that. And then Cameroon, I think, is the other country, the country that's kind of to the west of it. It's about the size of Ukraine in land area, but its population is only 5.5 million. So it's a very sparsely populated country. It has really kind of significant natural resources, including gold and diamonds and so on. But it's one of the poorest countries in the world, notwithstanding. Life expectancies, in the mid to late 40s. Has about 50% adult literacy. There is endemic kind of corruption in its politics and its civil life, including a long-running civil war. And all of this is reflected in the novel, very much so. But Yabouza approaches it with a kind of black humour and even a degree of optimism, I suppose, that makes it a very enjoyable novel to read. History. So history. It's always hard to know where to start with an African nation, isn't it? Like people have lived there for so long and, but there tends to not be that much detailed written record in sort of particularly in Central African countries until relatively recently. what can you say? Basically there was millennia of people, growing cassava and fishing the great rivers that passed through and along the edge of the country. 16th century, trade's increasing, and you actually get the impact of the slave trade on the country, sort of both kind of the Nile, North Africa, and then the sort of Western Congo ports, and where and that sort of has no doubt had a distorting effect on the economic development of the country. In the 19th century, the Europeans start kind of turning up in the form of missionaries and traders and adventurers. At the same time, at that point, there was a Zandi kind of empire that covered that area. Then by the end of the 19th century, the French were getting really interested in that part of the world. It was part of the European sort of scramble for Africa, as it's called. And they ultimately take control of what is now Central African Republic. This was no walkover, mind you. At that point, there was a Sudanese kind of warlord running the country, and they had to wrest it from him, with military force. His name was Rabiel Zaber, and but it became part of what was known as French Equatorial Africa, big area. And when the French sometimes kind of make out that a lot of their overseas empire was about kind of making other countries, kind of other places, part of France, well, no, certainly French Equatorial Africa was all about asset stripping. And in Central African Republic, there was a system of forced labour to make local people work to produce rubber and cotton, and then subsequently to work on the railways. Interestingly, there was probably the most significant sub-Saharan rebellion against French colonial rule happened in Central Africa. It was called, now let me get this right, I can't remember the name, but it was between 1928 and 1931. Oh yeah, it was called the War of the Small Hoe, as in the agricultural tool. It was big, but was suppressed. Now, 1958 was when they got autonomy, and 1960 it became an independent country, kind of complicated by what had happened in World War II, but yeah. So 1960, independent Central African Republic set up. Our author, Adrienne Yabouza, was born in 1965 there. So she's around the same age as me. She's still alive and kicking and writing. She started writing apparently at the age of 10, but she's a kind of like self-taught. She has no higher education at all, partly because her life was quite disrupted by how politically unstable the CAR has been since independence. I mean, it has basically had a sort of endless churn of coups and dictators, and one who declared himself emperor, that was Bokassa, and civil wars, and civil war continues to be an issue there now. I mentioned about it being similar in size to Ukraine. Another weird connection with Ukraine is that the Russian Wagner mercenaries are a really key part of the current civil war in Central African Republic. Anyway, Yabouza had to flee the country as a young woman. She went first to Congo and then ultimately got political asylum in France. Lived in France for a while, but then returned to CAR, continued to be vocal about political violence and corruption and so on, and she actually had to flee again in 2013. I'm not sure where she's living currently, whether she's back there now or not. You get a real sense of this in the book, I have to say. There's quite almost sort of satirical moments. The book is set at the time of elections, and the two co-wives, our two main characters, decide to go and vote, which they take, very seriously. Their husband's a little bit more sort of dubious about it, but as how she describes, this election, is there were 5 candidates, and it was like having to choose between 5 serious illnesses. Not a kind of straightforward democratic election system. Bribery, the importance of connections, the corruptibility of the courts, all that just is sort of part of the backdrop or the sort of plot mechanics of the book, because, that's how it is. I would say that Yabouza seems to me to be particularly interested in women's rights and, wanting to bring those kind of up in her writing in this novel, and also in particular the poor treatment of widows. So Nogopassi and Grek Pubu get on really well as co-wives. They're not, they treat each other as partners, not rivals. As a view of polygamy, it's quite a sort of, but it doesn't fit the mean that we'd have of of what polygamy is like for women. They almost like they share their husband, and also kind of like not exactly gang up against him, but they have solidarity with each other in their polygamous marriage, which is interesting. But she also is obviously particularly keen to talk about the poor treatment of widows, and it is when Nogopassi and Grikpubu are suddenly and unexpectedly widowed that their relationship and partnership it finds new sort of depths and strengths, I suppose. They're up against it, and it's their friendship that is going to get them through. They're accused of poisoning their husband by kind of scheming friends and relatives. It's widows. I mean, I think it's a real social issue in many countries, and obviously Central African Republic being one of them. That of people looking to do widows out of any kind of inheritance, and accusing them of witchcraft or poisoning or whatever is a way to achieve that. They are resourceful. They're helped by friends, particularly other women. It's like they're not helpless victims. She's outraged by what happens to them, but she doesn't write them as weak. Quite the contrary. As a read, it's fun, it's lively, it's fast. You might read it in a couple of sittings. It's not long. It moves between tragedy and humour, but in a really successful way. That feels very natural. It's an excellent translation, I think. It really brings out the sparkle of the writing. This is well written. I really enjoyed the two main characters. It's interesting. I think Yabouza was widowed herself, and she supported herself and her children by running a hairdressing salon in Bangui, the Central African Republic capital. And my feeling as a reader is that she has made really good use of her time in that hairdressing salon, listening to people's stories, listening to different characters, listening to women talking about their husbands, their children, their friends, their the dialogue, the characterization aspects of the plot. I feel they're all drawn from real life, and she writes it in a way that her customers could also enjoy. If I have a grumble about this book, from my perspective, it's that the ending is a bit sort of romantic and heartwarming, and I probably would have liked it to have a sort of grittier, more miserable ending, because that's the kind of book I love. But I imagine that her Central African Republic readers would probably be quite happy to see Ndongo Passy and Krekbubu kind of come good in some way, and support each other as they do that. And if you live in a country that is racked by civil war almost indefinitely, it seems, maybe you're entitled to enjoy a book with a happy ending. So but that means we can enjoy it too. If you've read this book, do tell me. I would love to hear anyone else that has read it. But if you haven't read it, definitely one to consider. Readily available and a fast, enjoyable and revealing read.